You ever notice how the story keeps on changing, but the facts don't? One day it's escalation. Next day it's a ceasefire. But then the fighting keeps on going anyway. And we're supposed to just follow along like that all makes sense somehow. And then it all starts to sound familiar because we've seen this show before. Check this out.
Well, I think, Bob, really, to be honest with you,
Sure, I want you to.
I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't want to create a panic.
You see, the more he lies, the more we know he's trying to control. But people are tired of this back and forth. They're tired of the manipulation, the outright lies. Because at some point, you stop asking, what did he say today? You bypass the man and you start looking at the facts yourself. And I think that's what we're seeing. Welcome to Quiet Loud. I'm DeAnthony Collins. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, join the Quiet Quorum. All right, so let's get into it. Yeah, there is supposed to be a 2-week ceasefire going on right now between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. But I think that Israel didn't get the message because at the same time, the Middle East is still hot and active right now. According to BBC and Al Jazeera reporting this week, Israel has continued strikes into Lebanon, including areas in and around Beirut. And in response, Iran-aligned forces have escalated activity across the region, while there are renewed disruptions and threats tied to the Strait of Hormuz. So while the messaging says stuff like ceasefire, the reality on the ground looks a lot more like controlled escalation. Now let's talk a little bit about what shifted, because multiple outlets, including Reuters, have reported that negotiations are moving forward under a framework much closer to what Iran proposed and not the 15-point plan that the U.S. was initially pushing. And that matters because for all of the threats and of war crimes that we have been hearing of to totally annihilate and kill their civilization and then to turn around and accept their terms as a starting point for negotiation is kind of weird. It sounds like capitulation to me, which most people thought that that threat was bluster anyway. But the man is walking around with the nuclear codes and is somewhat erratic. So we have to take what he says with a grain of salt, but also believing that he will do something completely beyond the pale. But globally, I think that's being read as a step back from earlier threats and not a follow through, or taco, as people like to call it. If you've never heard that before, it means Trump always chickens out. At the same time, there's reporting again from Reuters and other regional outlets that J.D. Vance has been part of the effort with Pakistan, helping to facilitate those communications. Now, I was talking about in the previous episode with my first ever guest on the Quiet Law, Anton Marshall, that I could see J.D. Vance kind of in the background trying to, I use the word sharpening his knife, but what I really meant was positioning himself to take control. I think as Trump is spinning out here, he is probably being advised to distance himself somewhat. I mean, after this ceasefire thing kind of went up, he's been in Hungary involving himself in the Hungarian presidential election, where Viktor Orban, who has been, under fire for doing the same things that Trump has done in terms of trying to subvert an election and everything, trying to help him get back into power. So that's a whole nother weird thing. But what we do have is shift in negotiation terms, because once the ceasefire was broken, Trump was asked, well, they're striking Lebanon, and he's going, well, that wasn't a part of the deal. Well, clearly, the spokespeople for Iran are saying it's absolutely in the deal. He accepted our 10-point plan as a negotiating partner. He's saying, well, their 10 points are 10 points from my original 15-point plan. Do we believe this? Of course we don't. It sounds more likely that they would have agreed to open up the strait, which they have not backed down on, even in the threat of this total civilization being annihilated. They never backed down on that point. So I don't believe that they took 5 or 10 of his points and said, here, let's start with these. I totally believe that he just accepted theirs because they knew that his bluff was called. So we've seen the repositioning happening here, and let's kind of look at what that means at home, because it's not going to stay contained over to the Middle East. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has long tracked this, because about 20% of global oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz, which we know by now. It's a fifth of the world oil. Any disruptions there, even temporarily, can push the markets. We've seen this. We saw this at the 2019 tanker crisis. Oil spiked nearly 20% when the Russia-Ukrainian war started, rather the Russian invasion, we'll call it. Energy, food prices, everything surged globally. It turns into higher gas prices. It turns into more expensive groceries. It turns into increased cost of living. And Americans are already feeling it here before all of this started. Okay. Recent polling, including with Reuters Ipsos, shows disapproval on the economy pushing toward 70%. So a ceasefire on paper, yeah, that's what they're saying. But in reality, the fighting is still happening, and the markets are still reacting, and people like us are still paying for it. And that's the part that we can't ignore, because war doesn't just stay over there. It hits us too. And when it starts hitting people like that, and we're talking about money and stability and their day-to-day quality of life, that's when politics start to shift. And that happens quickly. We're starting to see that, even his supporters are not happy with the way that this is going. We're starting to see, like, for real, honest to goodness, triple Trumpers out here. Folks like Alex Jones, folks like Tucker Carlson are starting to come out against not only this war, but against Donald Trump himself. So let's come on back home and talk about what's been happening here and how the elections themselves are being framed, because, what he's doing now is going to have an effect on what people are thinking as we roll into the midterms. And that part matters just as much. So let's start with what we know. Across multiple special elections this year, covered by AP News and other state level reporting, Democrats have been overperforming in districts that were expected to be, they were historically Republican strongholds. Now, we're not talking landslides here, but we are talking movement that is causing major erosion on the Republican side. And in politics, that kind of movement can be a warning sign. Like the polling, for example, according to Reuters Ipsos, again, like I said before, economic disapproval is sitting somewhere near 70%. That's not just a messaging problem. That is a severe vulnerability. 70% means all the Democrats and a good sizable portion now of Republicans. That's the voting electorate, that 70% that they're talking about. So what happens when support softens, but the power is still in reach? That focus starts to shift. And then you start to hear language like fraud and foreign interference and emergency authority, right? And those just aren't Trump talking points or MAGA talking points. They like to turn those into action. Check this out.
This cap holds about 1,500 poppy seeds, and each seed is a proven case of voter fraud over the last 40 years, according to the Heritage Foundation. This is all of it. Every recorded voter crime in 40 years of American elections. We're going to compare it to this. This one cup holds 1 million poppy seeds, 1 million votes. And this stack behind me, this is the 1.2 billion votes cast by America over the last 40 years. That is what they're saving us from.
So there's been a renewed focus on legislation like the SAVE Act, which will require documented proof of citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. Now, on paper, that sounds straightforward because, after all these years, adults have some kind of a driver's license, so it's not a huge problem to show your driver's license. That was kind of a give that Democrats, I think, over time were kind of just like, hey, okay, pick your battles. But according to analysis from groups like the Brennan Center for Justice, which I've talked about when referencing the SAVE Act in past episodes, so go back and check those. And reporting reference across outlets, including the AP, millions of Americans don't have easy access to those documents, okay? Especially elderly voters or married women whose names have changed over time, anybody who's had their name changed and it doesn't quite match their birth certificate. We're talking low-income voters. We're talking people who don't have passports. It changes, literally, who can successfully register to vote. So let's talk a little bit about absentee voting because this is where some of that contradiction shows up. And we keep hearing repeated claims about mail-in voting being corrupt or rigged, but according to AP and other state election records, they've shown that many of the same political figures raising these concerns, most especially Donald Trump, use absentee voting themselves. A special election that was just had in Florida a couple of weeks ago, in which a Democrat won in a district that represents Mar-a-Lago, Trump voted absentee in that one. Even though he was in town and could have voted in person, he still voted absentee. So clearly, the issue isn't the method. It's voter suppression, plain and simple. Because if you can convince the people that a system is untrustworthy, then fewer people will use it. And when fewer people use it, the electorate changes. There's less people. There's less of a pool to pull from. It's easier for Republicans to win when less people vote. Now, add into that mix that there have been public statements and proposals reported across outlets like Reuters and Focus, other immigration and focus coverage, raising the possibility of ICE at locations, okay? Including major events and gatherings. So can you see where I'm going with this, right? Because historically, even the perception of law enforcement near civic activity can affect the way people show up, whether there's a good turnout or not. We know this because we've seen versions of this before. During the 1960s civil rights era, there were documented instances where law enforcement presence at or near polling locations had a chilling effect on voter participation, particularly among Black voters. That's part of what led to protections in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not because people were explicitly blocked every time, but because pressure and presence can be enough to intimidate voters. All right, so let's connect it to the legal side. We're already seeing courts start to push back, as reported by AP and federal court coverage, on attempts to stretch certain statutes to justify the way Trump did tariffs. He did it under emergency claims, okay? And that's key because it just shows the playbook being tested in real time. You declare an emergency. You use an existing old-fashioned law, right, that people have kind of forgotten about. You expand its application to fit whatever it is that you're talking about, and you check to see if it works. And if it works if nobody says anything about it, if there's not an uproar, if it just kind of, people, it may be a little bit of murmur, but nobody's really doing anything about it. And if it works, it becomes precedent. And if it doesn't, you scrap it or taco, right? And then you just try another angle. So when people hear stuff like fraud or interference or emergency, it's not just noise. Those are justifications that can be used to change rules around participation, not necessarily stopping you outright from voting, but by making it harder and riskier and more confusing to take part in voting. And it's our civic right to be able to do so. But if somebody's already thinking ahead like that, they're not going to wait until election day to start acting. He's going to start building that over time, which is why we've been hearing this fraud talk since before he was elected the first time. He even said that the only way he would accept that the election was valid is if he won. I mean, come on. This is somebody who has been sowing the seeds of doubt the whole time. The election is fraudulent unless I win. But if I win, everything was great. That makes no sense. But let's talk about something that's not getting nearly enough attention, because there's a $38 billion expansion tied to ICE detention center facilities. Yeah, $38 billion. That's what we're talking about here. And we're not talking about the health care that they say we can't afford, or the child care that they say we can't afford, or the feeding our students breakfast and lunch that we can't afford, or making sure that Social Security will be there when my generation is ready to retire or my son's generation is ready to retire. We're not talking about that. We're talking about warehouse detention centers for holding ICE detainees. I mean, that's a huge growth, but it's not coming out of nowhere. This has been extensively reported. I've heard it several times on Rachel Maddow, and I think she and her team and other outlets like the AP and ProPublica and things like that have talked about it at length. Check this out.
Just at 26 million, they came in and paid 129 million. What's going on there? What's going on there? Well, I will just point out two other things that are going on that might shed a little bit of light on this ultimately. Number one, the Washington Post obtained an internal memo that apparently circulated last week, the day after Mark Wayne Mullen was sworn in as the new head of Homeland Security. That memo reportedly said that the process of turning these warehouses into Trump prison camps is going to be slowed down, that the proposals for these facilities are going to be revised, that they're going to start incorporating feedback from stakeholders, whatever that means, before they move ahead with these Trump prison camps. Why is that? Why are they slowing down? What's up with that? Well, that there's a new Inspector General investigation into alleged corruption at the Department of Homeland Security. The soliciting and handling of contracts, quote, including the involvement of former Secretary Kristi Noem and her de facto chief of staff, Corey Lewandowski. There was already...
So basically, the federal government is often overpaying, hugely overpaying private contractors and companies like the Geo Group and Core Civic, and they're receiving massive long-term deals, and some contracts include guaranteed payments, and that's whether the facilities are used or not. And what that means is, whether or not there's bodies in those beds, they're going to be getting paid like it is. So it's going to be incentivized that they put bodies in those beds. It's the same things that are happening in our private prisons. Think about that. All right? That means that our money is being committed ahead of the need. All right? There are people who need this money that is being spent. When you're spending twice the ask to buy this building, when a building is cost, $26 million and you spend $129 million, and that's before any renovations you're going to do to this place, what's that for? Where's that money going? Right? It seems like some self-dealing might be going on, but then you're also telling the public that we can't afford to do the things that the public needs to be done, things for the public good. But now let's look at what's happening locally, because the communities are pushing back. We've seen, local zoning boards showing resistance. We've seen local officials, raising all kind of cost concerns and talking about what it would do to their town's utilities, and transportation, roads and bridges and everything else. We've even seen some folks going and putting lock boxes on their water meters of buildings that have already been purchased. I think they did that over in Social Circle in Georgia, because they know what comes with this. It's going to be economic impact and strain on their local systems, like I said, and long-term footprint will change. And they'll be known as the town they'll be known as the ice town. Because what we've found out is that right now, I think through the years, they've been able to house somewhat, maybe 30,000 folks, detainees rather, and that's nationwide. Now we're looking at millions. Why do they want to keep people like this for this long? I thought the aim was to get them out of our country. So why are we putting them into prison camps? Very weird. These are things, again, that we should really sit down and give some thought to. All right. After 9/11, the U.S. built out large-scale detention and surveillance infrastructures. And at the time, a lot of it was framed as precautionary. But what once existed has now expanded, okay? DHS was born out of that post 9/11 time. Department of Homeland Security, yeah. All this ICE and all that, TSA, that wasn't always, okay? For those of you who are young enough not to remember that, okay? That's all post 9/11 stuff, and it may or may not have to exist. We need to think about that. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say, because all of these things have happened. They're documented. Okay. So when you see billions that they say we can't afford being allocated, facilities expanding, contracts accelerating, and we don't know to who, it's fair to ask, what is this thing being built for? Because systems like this don't just sit around there being unused. Okay. All right. So one last thing before I let you get out of here. Okay. Some folks like to say that none of this by itself feels like the moment. Okay. The ceasefire headline, the court rulings, contracts that most people never hear about. But when you step back and you look at it all together, it starts to feel a little bit less random. And it starts to feel like a direction that we are being walked into. You keep hearing people talk about authoritarianism, dictators, and all that kind of talk. All right. It's time to start taking a more bird's eye view of what's happening here in this country. Stop listening to all the one-offs. Stop getting lost in all of the single statements that they make, and start stepping back. All right. That could open the door. What they're doing could open the door to so much more. We think that it's nothing when he makes an executive order here, an executive order there. But perhaps What we're seeing here, like I said, could open the door to so much more, and maybe even be the predicate for this third term argument that we keep hearing people mutter about. And people are starting to feel that. I think that's why folks are starting to increasingly become more frustrated now. Not because they don't understand, but because they're starting to. All right? We're hearing a lot more, give me grace. We're hearing a lot more, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't think this is what I was voting for, even though we all told them. And it's okay to feel all your feelings because we did tell them. They just need to do better next time. All right, y'all. I appreciate you stopping by and coming to sit with us in the Quiet Loud. Please like, subscribe, join the Quiet Quorum. Stay grounded, stay informed, and stay loud. Quietly. This is the Quiet Loud. I'm D. Anthony Collins. Y'all take care.